I am simply going to introduce Professor Maureen Raymo, who will introduce the speaker and respondent. Maureen Raymo is a marine geologist and climate scientist who works at Columbia. She is where she's the G. Unger Vetlesen Professor of Earth and Climate Sciences. She's co-founding Dean of the Columbia Climate School and Director of Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory. Her research focuses on the history and causes of climate change in the past, including understanding consequences of climate change for sea level and ice sheet stability. She's an extremely accomplished and much awarded climate scientist, and I want to welcome her now. So please help me welcome Professor Maureen Raymo.
It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Alison Bashford. Alison is the Laureate Professor of History at the University of New South Wales, Sydney, and the Director of the Laureate Center for History and Population. Her work connects the history of science, global history, and environmental history into new assessments of the modern world from the 18th to the 20th centuries. She is the author of several books, including Global Population, History, Geopolitics, and Life on Earth, published by Columbia in 2014, as well as The New Worlds of Thomas Robert Malthus, Rereading the Principle of Population, published in 2016. Before joining the University of New South Wales, Professor Bashford was the Vere Harmsworth Professor of Imperial and Naval History at the University of Cambridge, Fellow of Jesus College, Cambridge, and Trustee of Royal Museums in Greenwich, UK. Alison was awarded the Dan David Prize for her contributions to the history of health and medicine in 2021. Alison, we're so glad we got you here. Welcome.
Look, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for sticking with me as we, let's blame it on different hemispheres for the moment. Really, really grateful for the invitation and lovely to be with you. And I know there are some old friends amongst you. Hello to you. So last year, when we were all thinking about Glasgow, and of course, there we go. When we were all glued to what was going on in Glasgow, a tweet came my way, and it was this one. An older man gave this card to younger protesters on the street, and they were quite, they objected quite strongly. So the tweet ran, an older man was giving these out to young women at the climate march, and this is everything that's wrong with the debate. And I was very interested in the quick exchange and the critique, and it proved for me a very useful summary about, I was going to say lay expertise, but protesters at Glasgow would hardly be cast as that. The original comment said, obviously putting the responsibility onto women in the global south is deplorable. And that's easy enough to understand and true and familiar. And there was a follow-up comment, slightly more difficult to decipher, I think. It read, but there's a wider thing of the problem always being something someone else has to do differently. The problem was partly that the populationmatters.org card here was distributed by a man in his 60s, devolving responsibility to mitigate climate change onto young women. But he's right, though, commented the next in the line of Twitter comments. This could solve damn near every problem we have on Earth. He's wrong, though, was the response. We're already making fewer people, and lots of them have negligible carbon footprint. Total population growth will be caused by longer lives. That person had been reading Kavita Sivaramakrishnan really clearly. And then the histories of certain kinds of demographic transition started kicking in. You've missed the point, said one, that the consumption patterns of one person living in an OECD country like you or I do more damage than 4, 5, 10 of the people you're talking about. And finally, quite an interesting comment, not surprising, but important. This presumes population will inevitably go up forever, which it won't. Birth rates fall dramatically as nations develop, this person said. We're more likely to be looking at a totally different type of demographic crisis once the developing world catches up. So this is a really complicated and quite difficult to decipher tangle that I'm very interested in. And for me, it was an interesting generational display. On the one hand, advocacy of fertility control. To many of these folk on the street of Glasgow, it seemed as antique as the hard copy little card on which the message was delivered. On the other, capacity to respond politically was as current as Twitter. And entirely unsurprisingly, from the streets of Glasgow and beyond, there was quite an eloquent critique of global North and South inequities. And I'm interested in the exchange as a generational one, I think, also because it caught both the net population growth problem of classic overpopulation crises at its height, perhaps in the 1960s and 70s. But it also caught awareness of the newer phenomenon of fertility decline across most of the world. Well, we know a good deal about the former, about the geopolitics and the biopolitics of the first, the overpopulation crisis from an earlier generation. But I think we know far less about the second, the geopolitics and the biopolitics of the long but accelerating fertility decline globally considered. Still less do I think we understand how to stitch those two phenomena together over time. And that's what I've been becoming very interested in. How do we think about connecting that, let's say, 1950s, 60s, 70s high point of the crisis of global overpopulation, as they would put it, to our own concerns, of course, about climate crisis, our own conceptualizations of an Anthropocene, but also the fact of global fertility decline. And so it's stitching those two, more than two generations of thought and politics together. And that means placing population quite precisely within the Anthropocene from the 1950s Great Acceleration forward. So let me just pause for a moment to think again about the Great Acceleration thesis, which I know is familiar to this audience entirely, but I'm unsurprisingly very interested in putting population inside that discussion, which is sometimes quite uncomfortable, even unfashionable, actually. Well, both geoscientists and historians deal with the past, as we know, and we both, as thinkers of the past, are keen on periodizing it. As a historian, actually, I still appreciate the original periodizing of the Anthropocene with the late 18th century, with industrialization, which is also a class for historians, a classic threshold of political late modernity, a revolutionary age. This puts this original Anthropocene periodization circa 1800, puts it squarely inside what historians call the modern period. And so it really appeals actually to many of us. In so many ways, the shift to coal-based economies is canonical business of economic historians, of modern historians, of historians of industrialization. So it's really highly suggestive, that original 1800 Anthropocene, and it correlates with the beginning of population growth in England and also for odd reasons in France. But that periodization is just this historian's fancy, so to say. People far more learned and expert than me are able to calculate the multiple variables of socioeconomic activity and Earth systems activity, and they tend to commit to the 1950s version. where we see the great upswing, the great acceleration. You'll all be familiar with this. But what I'm interested in is from the beginning of that discussion, what is variable number one? Population, human population growth from about 1 billion in 1800, doubling and doubling again at an accelerating rate, approaching 8 billion. So population is often a difficult thing to talk about, but I'm interested in facing it very squarely, not least because in the Great Acceleration thesis, it is invariably the first variable to be considered. And net population growth over the Great Acceleration, the Anthropocene, is a matter of fact that we need to deal with, not a matter of interpretation in and of itself. Well, all of these very familiar graphs link 1950 to now. But in terms of scholarly and political analysis, there's actually a great chasm between the population planetary crisis of the 1950s and 60s and 70s and the climate change planetary crisis of our own time, as if they're not linked at all. In the light of the great critique of population control, most scholarship wants to separate out that era entirely from our own. There is, and you'll be familiar with this, almost a wall between that moment of planetary crisis and our own moment of climate change crisis. And there is a trend, of course, this will come as no surprise to any of you, the desire to separate out those generations, to separate out ourselves from this population bomb moment is correct, important, true in many ways. But as you'll see, I'm starting to think that it's insufficient and even disingenuous, actually. I'll turn shortly to just why human population growth, the first variable in the Great Acceleration, has been so effectively removed or minimized, I think, from Anthropocene discussion. But first, let me set out quite quickly, as a historian, some of the connections, not just the similarities, between the generation that responded to the Great Acceleration in the 1950s and our own attempts to both recognize and mitigate the effects of accelerating change in human and Earth systems. First and most broadly, the acceleration of global population growth very early on in the 20th century, actually before the what we know as the moment, the 1950s moment of the Great Acceleration, before World War II, was recognized very clearly as a planetary crisis. And this is one of my arguments in the Global Population book, that the planetary crisis, that recognition of accelerating population growth created, was a pre-existing formation of crisis, not invented after World War II, but rather that moment intensified the awareness of it. It was analysed and developed by statisticians, very early ecologists, soil scientists, economists, in much earlier generations. Like this book from 1928 by George Handley Nibbs, a physicist, thinking about resources, limited resources, and how the world is going to continue to convert energy in a reliable and ongoing and actually sustainable way. So there's a very old discussion here. Second, even before the Great Acceleration of the World War II moment, but certainly in the light of it, this planet-level crisis was understood to be human-induced. Even a crisis of possible species self-extinction, because population growth was understood to change the face of the Earth. then, a little unlike now, the strata or the surface layer of the biosphere was foregrounded most. A lithosphere crisis, really perhaps more than an atmosphere crisis. Topsoil was what then population growth was attached to in that era, immediately and automatically. Population then was connected to food production, which was connected to soil. And we need to remember, I think, this much earlier population food soil connection at the beginning of the Anthropocene, because, and I think this is quite important, because it came to be overridden and semi-forgotten by a different kind of matrix, a population, reproduction, women's health connection that is more familiar to us. So that is, although now we tend to locate population within a reproduction, women's health domain, then population was far more readily connected to economic standards of living, to questions of food security, to soil and agriculture, to use of land, and therefore to early environmental questions of desiccation, deforestation, and desertification on a global scale. And so, whether we like it or not, the problematization of population growth sits right at the heart of one line of global ecological thinking and of environmentalism. So I might put it this way, if now carbon cycles are familiar enough, implicating us all within micro and macro scales of interaction, then it was perhaps less carbon cycles than nitrogen cycles that many scientists explain to press the urgency of human-induced change to the biosphere as energy was rethought. Many then who had addressed human population growth at the beginning of the Anthropocene, let's say the 1950s, already had a kind of multi-species politics at play, much as many commentators like to think that that's our generation's special intervention. Experts and advocates in the 1950s and 60s fully recognized that as human populations grew, exponentially more land was cleared for crops and livestock to feed that increase. That was really the number one problem of that era. Making room and food for humans was understood already to be at the expense of the habitat of other species, at the possible cost of their extinction. And this was then not marginal argument, it was more or less mainstream. Fourth, then, in developing just this list for the moment of connections that I think we need to admit, the development and the application of systems thought and feedback loops have carried forward from that time, of thresholds past, the idea of circular economies. These are familiar to the earlier generation of planetary crisis discussants. The Club of Rome limits of growth was in fact quite a late contribution, if an influential one, to a very clear and long refinement and calculation of the many variables of carrying capacity. And that included different kinds of economies, different patterns of actual and ideal consumption, much discussion about how we might gain proteins differently from vegetables and fish, not meat, and so forth. And finally, in this bringing forward, I suppose, of, and facing quite squarely, a link between that quite unpopular generation's formulation of population crisis and our own. When we talk now of forecasting and stabilization and offsetting and future costs, of thresholds passed and limits exceeded and reductions targeted, I think this is all borrowed talk, at the very least linked talk to that earlier moment of planetary catastrophe. In forecasting scenarios, we're all highly attuned to the difference between a 2 degree and a 1.5 degree target over the next generations. For those discussing planetary crisis in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, they were tuned into a different matter of forecasting, but a similar kind of fine tuning, a high awareness of changes in fertility rates for an Earth 2, 3, 4 generations into the future. So just how significant a change from 2.2% growth in net population per year to just 2% to 1.5% is kind of an echo of the fine gradations for future generations that we're quite used to discussing now. And I've become also interested in a linked history of political zero, actually, to consider here. So if now we work to a net zero initiatives and we discuss all the time the idea of zero carbon recovery, for example, and we have race to zero campaigns, this recapitulates in some ways both the race idea and the zero idea of the 1960s population crisis. And so we will all know that the demographer Kingsley Davis wrote of achieving zero population growth across the world in 1967, and that this grew into a small left, even counterculture identity of a young, environmentally aware generation, largely on the west coast of the States, young people taking on in that generation personally the ambition, the target of a global replacement or below replacement fertility rate as a matter of individual conduct. So zero population growth, whatever we think of it, was at the time understood to be an act of responsibilization towards planetary health, towards future generations. People taking on an individual cost for that future, and that resonates, I think. Well, this question, how do we think about world population in the Anthropocene? And there is a difference between that question and how should we. I'm not in the business of how should we think about population in the Anthropocene, but a little more interested in how do we. Well, one answer is that we do so rarely and certainly not squarely. So I think population is often sidestepped. And this is perhaps for good reasons. Perhaps entirely for good reasons. It's largely because of a highly successful critique of population control. This will be no news to you. That's rightly analysed and shown its high racism and sexism and its complicity in a colonial and an ongoing, perhaps colonial world and world view. So this critique over some time now has been so influential, so successful, that discussion of population growth has fallen into something like an abeyance except as critique. The history of the critique of population then is something itself that needs untangling and understanding. And to me, it's more interesting these days than the multi-stranded history of population management itself, about which we know a great deal. This history of this incredibly successful critique is actually, I think, far harder to understand. Why is it so hard to understand? Well, the fascinating and the challenging thing, and what keeps me continually drawn back to the kind of 360-degree problem of population, is that both advocacy for and opposition to birth control, population control, problematizing it, even thinking about it, can span the political spectrum. We can never be entirely confident about where the politics is in fact going to land. At any given point, population planning or even family planning or good birth control, let's call it, politically aware birth control, might be endorsed by deep ecologists, by liberal feminists, by right-wing fascists, by neo-fascist anti-immigrationists. The neo-Malthusian idea that limiting fertility correlates with an increased standards of living was held by the Kennedy administration, then the Johnson, and then the Nixon administrations, and then by Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s. Completely different politics, same idea. Likewise, opposition to population control or birth control in whatever form actually can come from radical feminism, from the Vatican, from Marxism, from the New Right, and from anti-racist immigration proponents. A couple of weeks ago in my centre's seminar, there was a very interesting discussion about interwar, so 1920s and 30s Anglican Church opposition to birth control, whose formal statement I suggested could have been written by Gandhi at the same time, and learned Indian participants agreed. So we can never be entirely sure about where our politics lands here or the uses to which it's going to be put. But over the 1980s and 90s, so let's say the generation after the initial great acceleration critiques actually of population growth, over the 80s and 90s, critiques of population planning bedded down, but it also did so right across this spectrum. A Marxist critique that any discussion of population deflects from the possibility and desirability of distributing resources equally. B, post-colonial feminists highlighting a history of race-based impositions. This was part of a history of eugenics, or of pressing responsibility willingly or coercively onto women and the disenfranchised. And I should note that that's probably where my own personal training and kind of intellectual and political base was. C, a new right critique that all state policies designed to reduce fertility rates are inherently coercive and not free. Also critiquing population and birth control, population planning in this era was ongoing theological and a social conservative opposition, especially from the Roman Catholic Church, perhaps the greatest global NGO, but followed up by a right-wing Anglophone evangelical conservatism as well. And as ever, this all takes some disentangling. Well, at the moment, I think that the British political scientist Diana Coole has probably done the best job of disentangling the intercontinental, national and global politics of the 1980s and 90s that ended up with a kind of a multi-stranded, highly successful critique of population control. And I won't, partly because we started late, I won't actually go through that, but I think that Diana Coole's work is very positioned and very careful, but I think that it is the job of historians and historians actually of political thought to start to really historicize that 1980s and 90s moment, after which population finds a very difficult kind of entry point into climate change discussion from the 2000s forward. So now in many scholarly circles, the feminist post-colonial critique has actually become the orthodoxy, a history of 20th century wrongdoing that is now well recognized and rightly so. You'll be familiar with this as well. The Washington Post, for example, runs a very typical article, quote, "Eugenics is trending, that's a problem. Any effort to slow population growth must center on reproductive justice." So this is where it gets a little tricky. I understand the history. I wrote some of that history. I understand the critique. I wrote some of the critique. For years, I've done both. But these days, however, I no longer find the orthodoxy of this critique intellectually sufficient. And I fully recognize how difficult and unfashionable it is to say so. Bear with me. So I've been reading recently in post-critique literature, which has come out of some sectors in humanities and social sciences. And I'm quite drawn, and I understand that this is, it will be interesting to have discussion. Let's say I'm experimenting as a historian with post-critique literature at the moment. But at the core of post-critique literature is a call to question or even abandon what is often called the dramas of exposure. And I do think that for my own discipline, so much history is written in a kind of an expose model. And I think that's insufficient. But I also think that one can only, there's a high politics going on here, and that one can only or should only move to a post-critique position, if I can put it that way, and wonder about the sufficiency of kind of exposés of population control history or the drama of exposure of wrongdoers of the past, if one is schooled in the reasons for the critique in the first place. But I still think that critique sometimes keeps us unnecessarily stuck and creates unnecessarily simple and unidirectional accounts of the past. One scholar asked recently, can the ideology of overpopulation ever be unmoored from its racist and colonialist legacies? No, she insists, and so we should leave the trouble of population behind entirely. But yes, I think if counterintuitively we suspend the critique and resist the pull to the drama of exposure, we might consider, for example, the anti-racist and anti-colonial legacy that also lies within this field, even if it's flawed, even highly flawed by our own measures. There's certainly a line of anti-colonialism, even anti-capitalism, within the history of the so-called population establishment, or populationists, as they are usually derided. It's not at all difficult, actually, to find therein a history of attempts to mitigate the effects of a planetary acceleration driven by a principle of equity. I'm not saying that their ideas or even the implementation of those ideas are models, goodness me, no, that we would follow. But I am saying that there is a line of flawed anti-colonialism, if I can put it that way, and anti-capitalism that is quite prominent at the time. Let me just give one example. On the face of it, a highly unlikely one, but this is where I think you learn things, actually. I'm beginning to learn more. The more I suspend critique, frankly, the more I'm learning as a historian when I go back to the sources. The first Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization, John Boyd Orr, Nobel laureate. At the heart of what critics call the population establishment, he was situated fully on the left, seeking to even up the problem of who was and who wasn't hungry in the world in 1948, 1950. And his plan to render that difference between who wasn't hungry in the world entailed white countries to give up power. And that's a quote from him. And he wrote a book, The White Man's Dilemma. The only way to secure global equity of resources and deliver freedom from want was for white men to give up their capacity to wield power in an economically unequal world. The white men of the world, he said, would lose control of the world they gained in their 300 years of conquest. That's the dilemma for him. Now, there's an interesting plan delivered by a Nobel laureate. So that's just one example. There are many. Here lies one tradition actually of social justice and equity that might well be pulled into the present discussions of population in the Anthropocene. In truth, many who perceived the great acceleration of the 1950s at the time are rather more like predecessors, intellectual and political antecedents, rather than political enemies, as the orthodox critique often sets them up to be. They embarked on the political program of turning around a great acceleration to save the planet, sometimes to save other species, trying to reduce impossibly large economic gaps. Yes, in one version, easy to expose, they were anti-communist activists who used the population and food security problem expediently. And when they finally accepted versions of contraception as a means, many were untroubled by the experimentation on disenfranchised populations in rural India or in Costa Rica, for example. In another version, however, the people who most understood the problem of the great acceleration at its beginning were the thinkers who gave us world ecology, who thought nature and culture together, who thought earth systems, who sought to manage a global biosphere and to redistribute foods in highly complex earth systems, all with an eye to the future. It sounds more like us than many care to admit. And especially, it's almost universally forgotten in the too easy critique that one driving ambition of fertility control was actually to do something about the massive global discrepancy in infant mortality. Well, population from that era is so tainted now that for some, the very word concept and its history must simply go. That is Michelle Murphy's position. And I recommend to you the wonderful pamphlet called Making Kin Not Population, edited by Adele Clark and Donna Haraway, where these positions are set out very interestingly and with great importance. So population as a term, as a concept must go, argues Michelle Murphy. But with Donna Haraway, actually, I think we have to stay with the population trouble, not least because Anthropocene forecasts are being made about human fertility and mortality rates anyway, and rightly so, in my view. The number of us into the future is being projected, should be projected, and not unreasonably, especially given we're all so keen to name us, name the anthro in the Anthropocene, to name the cost to the planet of the biomass, which is us. I'm grateful, for example, for the work that Joel Cohen at Columbia, the modeling work that has come out for many years from that laboratory and from Joel Cohen's work. As many of you would know, of course, he's calculated historical trends in human consumption that suggest that population growth is a variable in climate change mitigation, but not the variable. And in fact, casting back to the populationmatters.org card on the streets of Glasgow, that would probably come as a disappointment. But that measured response is exactly, and obviously evidence-based response is exactly what we need, I think. Some time ago, he indicated that sticking to the minimal UN projection for declining world fertility rates would contribute only to a stabilization of the atmosphere, offering a substantial, though not a dominant, mitigation. So the possibility of managing this variable sits alongside a suite of others, that we do so in the light of the intense critical work over several decades about how this is to be implemented is clearly key. Well, going forward, One news story is radically different age structures in regions of the world and in the world as a whole. And Professor Sivaramakrishnan is clearly expert there. Another is the long story of fertility decline. Fertility decline has a really spectacular modern world history. The average number of births per woman across the world dropped from around 7 in 1880 to just above 5 in 1950, the beginning of the Anthropocene, to 2.4 to now. Fertility is projected, as we know, to be below replacement level threshold of 2.1 by about 2050, and may move towards 1.93 births per woman by the end of the century. This is phenomenal. Noting this fertility decline, in one sense, is commonplace for economic historians. It's standard business. But perhaps it's so commonplace that historians sometimes fail to see this change for what it is, perhaps the single most consistently converging trend of modern world history. This was quite literally a kind of embodiment of the modern era. And we need to think about how this fits into the idea of a great acceleration. As always, there's a geopolitics here, but no longer a predictable global north, global south one. Fertility decline has been slowest in sub-Saharan Africa, fastest in Japan. Across the world over the last few decades, ultra-low fertility has driven a massive IVF industry, routinized in China especially. And in fact, I think these global population changes are confounding major world divisions between East and West, global North and global South. And we have to remember that the old idea and hugely influential idea that we no longer use of the third world and the first world are in fact terms and concepts invented within the sphere of demography at the beginning of the Great Acceleration. But all of that is starting to be confounded by this deceleration of fertility. The important thing to recognize, I think, is that we can't explain this incredibly quick decline in fertility by the critique of population control or birth control. The evidence that we have does not explain the decline as a success of the coercive population controllers, however much we want to and should critique all coercive measures. That is not what is producing this decline. What's producing this decline is still unclear, but behind it is clearly various kinds of choices on the part of millions and millions of individuals to have fewer children, perhaps largely because of the growth of number of women who are moving forward with education, and that there is a later first birth for many women across the world. This is a good thing. Perhaps this is more questionable, perhaps because the uptake of women in more of a labor force over these generations. There's a whole complex there, and there are more learned people than me able to answer the question as to why this fertility decline has taken place. Nonetheless, it's really clear to me that it also begins at the point of this great deceleration begins also at the point of the great acceleration in 1950s. Well, historians of the modern world often structure their arguments, our arguments, by tracking the idea of global divergence or global convergence. But this global convergence on the screen at the moment, I think, is phenomenal. When we consider population and reproduction of humans in modern world history, I think this is perhaps one of the greatest global convergences of all, the profound deceleration that's accompanied the great acceleration. For some, it's heralded as a great solution going forward in an era of climate crisis. For others, it is a kind of crisis. And that's a real turnaround from the 1950 beginning of the Anthropocene and the Great Acceleration to now. Then shelves were filled with books about the crowded planet, standing room only, how will we all fit on the limits of the Earth? Now trade bookshelves are starting to be filled with empty planet books. It's a real turnaround. When Japanese demographers publish, for example, an essay on the principle of sustainable population, obviously referring back to Malthus's essay, the sustainability for them at issue is less the ecologically imperiled planet and more the demographically imperiled species falling below replacement levels. Well, a quick sum up. I think that fertility decline obviously will go forward to be seen as the new crisis, but in fact, fertility decline has been part of the modern world population story all along, and a complicated one. As some populations doubled again in the first demographic transition to low mortality and high fertility, colonization meant that other populations actually halved and halved again as fertility rates dropped through infection, through forced relocations and removals, and as mortality increased through infectious disease and through killing. So in fact, this question of fertility decline over a long modern period needs to be understood as simultaneous. How do we think about population history in the Anthropocene? Well, that tangle of critique of population evident in the Glasgow Twitter exchange is very common, but that doesn't make it easy to understand. And part of what I want to do going forward is to historicize the critique and insist that it's often, even always, double-edged, triple-edged in its politics. And rather than continue to work to create a kind of a chasm between population wrongdoers of the beginning of the Anthropocene around the 1950s and critically and politically aware us, I'm actually more interested in seeing that generation as the first respondents to the Great Acceleration, named and in the 21st century. Actually, they were the first respondents of to the Anthropocene, the first variable of the Great Acceleration at its foundational moment. Population and planetary crisis then have a long and conjoined history. Thank you.
That was terrific. So we're going to start a discussion. I'm going to introduce our discussant, and we're also cognizant of the time, and we're going to try to rope in the audience quickly as well. But first, let me introduce Dr. Kavita Sivaramakrishnan. She is a public health historian of South Asia who studies the politics of health, medicine, and science in the global South. She's an associate professor of Sociomedical Sciences at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health, and the author of As the World Ages, Rethinking a Demographic Crisis. Before joining the Mailman School faculty, she was the David Bell Research Fellow at the Center for Population Studies and Development Studies at Harvard University. She received the 2004 Balzan Prize for Epidemiology for her work on social inequalities in health. Kavita, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maureen, and Alison too. Alison, I've long admired your work. I had intended to continue a little bit at length about how your scholarship has played such an influential role in the questions you've raised, but I think we're running short of time. So if it's okay with everyone, what I'll do is I'll quickly articulate two questions that I had, Alison, and then not questions really, but they're really reflections. And then I'll turn it over to Maureen, and I'd love to open it up to the audience as soon as possible. So my first reflection really was that if we're thinking of population histories and the Anthropocene as conjoined histories, how do we really begin to think, when we think of these population narratives, if we're actually thinking now of rebooting population and population history, as you suggest, population histories have often talked about the future. But when we're actually living in a crisis, when we're thinking of being within the crisis of the Anthropocene as we are just now, and within population histories, how do we then face it without thinking about a future crisis or a future catastrophe? How do we contemplate that? Do we then think of, how do we use population history, which has often been used by experts, whether it's demographers or gerontologists, of thinking of the future in ways in which they can then suggest ways to repair or to prepare for the future. So do we move away from this crisis and catastrophe kind of framing? My second question really harks back to certain questions of moral responsibility that are common both to population politics and population histories, as well as the questions of the Anthropocene. So when we think about the attribution of responsibility, I was thinking that one of the works that's often occurred, that's a useful lens to analyze this is Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narayan's well-known work in 1991, Global Warming in an Unequal World, a Case of Environmental Colonialism. So there's been, of course, a critique, therefore, of the Eurocentrism of concepts, whether it's notions of, the origin of the Anthropocene itself, locating it in a history that's far too closely one of European industrial history. So how do we rethink where this starts from, really? How do we rethink moral responsibility? How do we then begin to think of the temporality and this periodization in a slightly different framing if we think of these categories themselves as being deeply political? The final question I had for you was, if we are rebooting and thinking of population and these conjoined histories, how do we think of these newer questions that have come up? Questions now in population politics, questions of fertility decline, questions of increasing longevity or the longevity revolution. These increasingly show us a new set of politics, a new set of categories that are being invented, which is when societies have such differential experiences of high and low fertility, how can we begin to extrapolate and generalize another set? Are we just getting into one more set of population-related politics? Within India itself, it's very hard to think about framing population history simply in terms of longevity or falling fertility. In states like Uttar Pradesh, you have a life expectancy of just early 60s. In Kerala, you would have it at 75 or more. So when you have these kinds of differentials, how do we really assume certain kinds of certainty when we think ahead of reinventing, recasting population histories in the Anthropocene, where they may just pose a different set of problems? And then finally, a piece of work of yours that I really enjoy, where you're analyzing Julian Huxley and his work in the UNESCO, how he seeks to kind of, within the UNESCO itself, place evolutionary progress at the heart of the UNESCO agenda. And he thinks of this as a way in which actually we could think beyond politics, as a way of creating a more peaceful and productive community, of a kind of kinship of those who are trustees of life on Earth. So I'm thinking again, if we conjoin both these discourses in a way, what kinds of politics will emerge from it if we think of both of these together? Aging in some ways brings in a different set of politics. When we think of longevity, it's the remaking of welfare. It's the thinking of dependent bodies, and to think beyond, to think about making older populations productive. So what is the new kinds of politics that are going to emerge if we rethink population histories? And I think that's one thing we have to really keep in mind, because we think of this, that's one of the problems I have even when Michelle Murphy is talking about repairing and going forward. How can we really repair and go forward and kind of set aside, anti-colonial thinking and legacies in some ways? Is there any way of repairing that at all? Because I think all of this is deeply political going forward as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and lovely to talk to you. And I know we have a short time, and can I just say I hope this is the beginning of a conversation that we can pick up in other fora, and I'm sure that that's the case. I will make it the case. Look, I'm not going to answer all of those because I want to get some responses also, if that's okay, Kavita. But I think that that hard question, I think it's your second one, of what do we do with the kind of Eurocentric start of this population awareness, I suppose, if I can put it that way. And I in my global population book and elsewhere, one of the things, without, well, fully owning and in fact analysing that Eurocentric start, I've also been really interested, as you know, in what response in different parts of the world so why was it that in the development of North Indian ecological and economic thinking, this question of population was so taken up? You know, not least by Radha Kamal Mukherjee, for example, but many others. So what is it that's resonating so strongly by this interwar generation, who are highly cognizant, if highly flawed, I mean, they certainly were by our own measures, but highly cognizant of the many variables? And so what I'm interested is in rescuing, I suppose, not rescuing only in the sense of putting on the table for our thought and our awareness that these are, it's insufficient to see them all as wrongdoers, even the most Eurocentric. We understand that it's a European out idea. We also need to understand that some of those Europeans who put, you know, the population problem on the table were some of the earlier 20th century's more prominent anti-racists. We need to, I mean, it's very much a historical project for me. And so for me, what's insufficient is, and I'll try and keep this really, you know, what's insufficient is simply using sort of early 20th century actors, whether it's eugenicist Radha Kamal Mukherjee or anti-racist and eugenicist Julian Huxley, who's also trustee of nature, who's also one of the people who starts the idea of conservation, who starts World Wildlife Fund. We need to understand how rather than simply blaming them or simply setting them aside, or simply using them, actually I think this happens a lot, using them to set up our own purity, if I can put it that way, our own political superiority and purity. I think they're used in that way all the time. And I will often say that explaining them that era is not explaining it away, but it's my job as a historian to understand that. I mean, there is a deep politics about moving forward, and we know this from your own work, about aging and fertility decline, and it's a different conversation. I do think that a lot of the literature, I'll end with this, a lot of the literature that is intends to keep the critique of population matters up and even put population off the agenda entirely, tends to be focused on the fertility question and birth questions, and ignores or sets aside or doesn't face squarely what we know, that, you know, population growth is about longevity and about aging, and what's happened in completely different age structures across the planet as a whole compared to the 19th century or even the 20th century. And also, as you well know, we know from your work, completely different age structures in different regions, and even within, as you say, within different polities. But I'm dissatisfied with the kind of almost ruse that the critique of population puts on the table, that keeps it stuck with the fertility question, when the mortality and the longevity question is in fact arguably more important, and the politics of that needs to come together. Perhaps I'll take your other questions forward if we lose discussion time, but move on for now. Thank you.
Well, There is a question in the chat, and I would encourage anyone to raise their hand if they would like questions too. Now, I, as a scientist, have been aware that birth rates have been falling. That last figure you showed, I mean, that's really encouraging in a way. It's like the focus should be on trying to decarbonize our economies. My understanding was that education of women and economic empowerment was a big part of that. Maybe you could speak to that. But the question here actually in the chat, and I'll read it in a second, is actually, I think maybe one I was thinking about too, and it might be jargon. I think of the birth rate is falling, not as fertility is falling, but maybe that's just definitional. So the question is, what do we know about changes in male and female fertility, i.e. the ability to fertilize, oocyte, spermatocyte deficits, environmental chemical exposure effects? So is fertility falling, or is it just the birth rate falling?
So this is also the kind of, can you see that?
Yeah.
I think that's the other conversation that's happening at the moment, that there's a kind of environmental toxicity to the 21st century, which is affecting sperm. And, I'm really interested in, I'm really interested in that kind of conversation, which is a completely different kind of crisis book. And it's the decline again, that this is seen to be the new crisis, fertility decline for a range of reasons. And we see on the kind of popular shelves, the empty planet, the fertility decline, the sperm count decline, due to, the usually understood to be a kind of a toxicity to the modern world that is an environmental problem. So do I have the expertise to say whether that's true or not? No. Somebody else in the audience may.
Do you?
But what I can diagnose is this this is where another kind of politics creeps in here altogether, which is if there's such discussion, but there's the fact of fertility decline, there's a lot of discussion about why, and we're quite interested, surely, in not problematizing fertility decline if its cause, so to say, is women's higher socioeconomic placement net across the world, and even creeping amount of women's education. If that's what's causing the fertility decline, or the decline in the rate of births, this is surely not something that we want to interrupt. And in some ways, one politics is that that's arguably being interrupted by this other conversation that problematizes a kind of a toxic world in which sperm counts are being, that kind of can take the oxygen of the discussion of arguably quite progressive reasons why fertility is declining. But I do think that, I suppose what I'm, to kind of step back a little bit, what I'm interested in is listening and reading and taking account of the new deceleration and decline discussion that's happening, and putting that in the same story as the Great Acceleration from the 1950s. And that is, quite frankly, something that is, this is the first talk that I've given about it, and it's something that I want to move forward very strongly with, because it's not clear to me yet how we do that. And that's why I was very eager to take up this invitation to keep moving forward with the many factors and the many variables, because there's obviously a dangerous politics to halting or solving, let's put it, the fertility decline crisis by winding back something around women's education, or the kind of women's economic place. But it's a different kind of gender politics to the overpopulation and population control movement. But how they're linked, especially in those decades over the 1980s and 1990s, I think needs a lot more careful working through, and the trend to put population off the agenda entirely does not help us in that task.
Kavita, would you like to follow up on that?
I think, Maureen, I'd like to, but I think we should open it up to the other questions, perhaps. Maybe
There's no questions in the chat, and nobody's raised their hand unless I'm missing it.
I thought that I have.
If you have some in your chat, that would be terrific.
Richard Rice, is he here? He had articulated a question.
Oh, there he is,
Yes.
top left.
Yeah.
Richard?
What does this speaker think about this? Just giving women, well, there's really two things. One is giving women effective access to birth control. That is, poor women or in less developed areas. My second point is the author of Warmth, which we just read in my book club, contemplates the future, and he's trying to decide whether he actually wants to have a child, given the specter of the climate change, of the climate crisis, I should say.
The first question is, I'm all for it. And part of the long program here is how to, obviously, how to make birth control appropriate and available. I don't think there's any question there. The second comment, I do have a radar at the moment for discussion about a kind of an Anthropocene responsibility to, personally limit human biomass and consumption, not just by, being aware consumers and producers, but perhaps not reproducers. And that conversation comes up. I'm kind of trying to track it. I think it's coming up increasingly, but I'm not sure. But for me as a historian, the most interesting point is that it recapitulates a very familiar 1970s ZPG, zero population growth movement. And I'm very interested in a very similar adoption of responsibility at the absolute intimate and individual level. At the individual level, in that era, I will not, the ZPG mantra was not just to reproduce the classic couple as two, to reproduce yourself, but in fact not reproduce at all in order to offset what they would understand to be a problematic increase in population. But really what's interesting to me is the kind of highly individualized personal response, even cost, that one was enjoined to take, however small the zero population growth and limited it was, globally. And it was a very Euro-American response for obvious reasons. Other people that you would choose not to reproduce was the very opposite to the difficult population politics then going on. We know that. But I am really interested in, as a historian, in the kind of recapitulation of that very idea, that you take on a cost yourself, that's what you have control of, that you act at a highly individual level to do your bit, as they would say then and people would say now, to save the planet. And I think it's a very, very, for historians who know that era, or for people who know that era, it's not a new politics, it's a recapitulation of something quite old.
Well, Thank you for breaking the ice. Now we have a question from Banu Subramanian. Banu, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, I would very much like to. Alison, I've been such a fan of your work for so long, and I will say I'm so disappointed by this talk.
I knew you were going to say that.
And so I'm doing this in the spirit of feminist disagreement
Please
with
do.
much love. And that, we hope we can discuss things that we disagree with without being fractious or it being malicious. Because these are intellectual ideas we need to, really reconcile with, given climate change. So to me, given all your work and what I've read about climate change, I see the idea of population as a symptom rather than the focus of a problem. So that for me, population coheres as an issue around which lots of different issues, questions of demography, questions of poverty, questions of inequality, all cohere towards that. And part of the issue of our response to population has been to take it as the central problem, which becomes a problem of women's sexuality, and therefore a curtailing of women's sexuality with all the horrendous eugenic consequences that has taken on. And so I'm just a little surprised that you've gone a different place. And I'm sort of interested in why you've gone a different place than I feel your writings have taken us.
Yeah, thank you. I wish I could see you.
Well, I've tried to make my video, but
Oh no, but lovely to hear from you, and I know your work as well, and thank you very much. And in a way, the disagreement is something that I'm obviously inside, but that's why I really like the Adele Clark. Oh, hello, the Adele Clark and Donna Haraway production, which absolutely squarely owns disagreement and different views from a similar base. And I recommend the small pamphlet to you, where you have people with very different.
I have written about the small pamphlet,
I know,
which love and disagreeing with it.
I know, and I've read you on that. So one of the things that interests me is that I think that I don't feel like I've gone to a different line. I don't feel this is a great crossover for me to some other position. And I feel like sometimes there's the global population will come creeping towards this. And one of the things that really drove me in that global population book is the usefulness of knowing that historically population, I understand it catches lots of things. I take that point very seriously, that historically population was about women's reproduction and sexuality and problematic birth control and force and choice and all of that domain that we know so well, but that it was also about food, human fuel, land, topsoil, nitrogen cycles, as we know from, well, as I argue really strongly in that book, probably the premier historical problem of population was not really the politics, maybe it should have been, but it was not really the politics of which humans are and aren't reproducing. It was the problem of density and crowd and land use, and is there enough land on limited earth to feed the people, and so on and so forth. The answers to that question we might agree or disagree with, we do, and they were variable themselves. But what I really learned in that book, and I came to that project from a full training in medical history, in history of, women's health, in a kind of a 1990s feminist post-colonialism. And I thought that's the book that I was going to write. But I learned so much more about the kind of earth politics, if I can put it that way, even the earth systems politics that was standard for earlier generations of demographers, of economists, of the population establishment. And in part, that's what I tried to put forward in the Global Population book and want to keep forward now. And so if anything, the switch that I think I've done, and thank you for reading the book and knowing the ideas that I've put forward. The switch that I think I've done is that then, as a kind of a feminist medical historian, I was interested in putting if I can reduce this, the earth politics back into our understanding of what population used to mean. And the switch is that now possibly I'm doing the reverse. I'm interested in the reverse. In all the discussion about Anthropocene and climate change and environmental urgency, I'm interested in retaining, putting back the difficult question of population in the light of the critique, in the light of everything that we know, in the light of disagreement between you and me, for example, but not sidestepping it. And I think, so I've shifted maybe from, wanting to put earth politics back in the history, but wanting to keep a kind of a biopolitics and a population in the discussion now in a way that is more than simply critiquing and putting it to one side and not touching it. And that, I think, that inclination was already there in the Global Population book. And I called it then agnostic, me being agnostic. And at the beginning of that book, I said that, and I stand by this, that I learned more as a historian from actually being relatively unpositioned in reading this material and not repeating a critique that was already quite familiar. It's not saying the critique is untrue, and certainly not saying it's not useful, it is, but it's also familiar, we know it. And recapitulating that critique in that book, for me, was almost like saying nothing new. And there was this suspending the critique, being relatively unpositioned about what I was arguing about, what that older generation thought about population. To me, as a thinker, raised a whole new world of possibility, not least to be able to understand how they put all of that biological reproduction politics together with their generation's worth of earth politics. And that's where the post-critique literature is really speaking to me. It's partly an intellectual move where the critique is starting to be, the critique obviously had, imagine a world in which that whole generation of critique of population control didn't happen. Imagine that world. We certainly don't want that. But as a thinker and simply as a historian, I'm starting to not learn anything new. And that is partly about, the kind of core thing about why we do all our academic work. And I'm quite, this will sound a bit strange, but I'm kind of ecumenical about that. And I'm a great believer that some scholars, the politics of some scholars' work has to be upfront and is upfront and should be. The politics of other people's work need not be. And actually, I think that that's the case. And that may also disappoint you, but I find these days that the critique is not telling me anything new about the past, even though I recognize that our present without that critique would be a very scary place.
Well, thank you, Alison, for a fascinating hour and a fascinating discussion. I'm going to turn it over to Pamela just to wrap us up and say goodbye to everybody.
Well, first I want to thank our audience for sticking with us despite our technological problems. But mostly, I really want to thank Professor Bashford for that really fascinating talk, I want to thank Professor Sivaramakrishnan for, really, I wish that you could have had time to bring up all of your points and have Professor Bashford answer them. And thank you, Professor Raymo, for introducing, for providing a climate scientist perspective. And I very much hope we can come together again. I hope we can have you back, Alison and Kavita, to continue this conversation. And please join us. If you found this interesting, please join us. Please join our announcements and the center's membership. And thank you very much for coming. I think our next event is April 26th. Please join us then. Good night, good morning, good afternoon to everybody all around the world.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Alison and Maureen and Pamela and everyone at CSS and the audience too. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.